How does a single kingdom, once fragmented on the edge of Europe, come to command lands so vast that day never ends across its dominions? For over 300 years, one empire achieved just that, weaving continents together through ambition, sword, and sail. This is not merely a chronicle of battles and gold. It is the human saga of how a world was connected, for better and for worse, by the relentless drive of a nation called Spain. Its echoes are in our languages, our faiths, and our very conceptions of global power. So, let's trace the arc of this colossal enterprise, from its fractured beginnings to its ultimate unraveling. Our story starts long before ships crossed the Atlantic, in a place not yet called Spain. Picture the Iberian Peninsula, a rugged landscape where the sun beats down on a chessboard of rival realms. For centuries, this land was a frontier, a constant battlefield between north and south. Muslim caliphates held sway in the prosperous south, their cities centers of learning and luxury. In the cooler, mountainous north, a collection of Christian kingdoms clung to their faith and fostered a warrior spirit. This was a world of shifting borders, fragile truces, and a slow, grinding campaign known as the Reconquista, the Reclamation. But this push against Muslim rule wasn't a unified march. It was a messy, competitive scramble among proud, independent kingdoms. Among them, two would eventually rise above the rest, their destinies poised to merge and project power far beyond their shores. In the west, the Kingdom of Castile emerged. Its very name hinted at its character, Tierra de Castillos, a land of castles. It was a frontier society, militaristic and expansive, pushing its borders southward decade after decade, absorbing territory through force and faith. Meanwhile, on the Mediterranean coast, a different power was taking shape, the Crown of Aragon. While Castile looked inward to the peninsula, Aragon gazed outward to the sea. Through a shrewd marriage with the powerful county of Barcelona, it transformed from a landlocked kingdom into a maritime force. Its galleys patrolled the western Mediterranean, and its rulers captured islands like Sicily and Sardinia, building a commercial empire based on trade, diplomacy, and naval strength. Can you see the contrast? One kingdom, Castile, forged on the anvil of land warfare. The other, Aragon, crafted in the shipyards and marketplaces of the sea. For generations, these two mighty crowns operated separately, each with its own laws, traditions, and ambitions. They shared a faith and a common foe to the south, but little else. The peninsula remained a collection of distinct pieces. What could possibly fuse these different worlds into a single, formidable entity? The answer lay not in a treaty, but in a wedding. In 1469, a dynastic marriage changed everything. Ferdinand, heir to Aragon's throne, married Isabella, claimant to Castile's crown. This was not an instant unification. Spain as a single, centralized state did not yet exist. But it created a partnership, a formidable alliance between two of the peninsula's strongest powers. Together, Ferdinand and Isabella ruled in concert, a dual monarchy with a shared, relentless purpose. They were a perfect, if ruthless, match. Their first major project was to finish what their ancestors had started for centuries. On the southern tip of Iberia, the Emirate of Granada endured, the last jewel of Islamic Al-Andalus. For the Catholic monarchs, as they would become known, it was an intolerable anomaly. Granada was a symbol of unfinished business, a Muslim sovereign state within what they saw as a Christian sphere. So they turned their combined might against it. The war was long and costly, but in January of 1492, the city of Granada surrendered. The last Muslim ruler departed, and Ferdinand and Isabella entered in triumph. After nearly 8 centuries, the Reconquista was complete. The entire Iberian Peninsula was under Christian rule. This victory was more than a military conquest. It was a seismic ideological shift. It cemented the monarch's identity as divinely sanctioned Catholic rulers, a title soon officially granted by the Pope. Their realm was now unified under the banner of the cross. But what happens when a powerful, newly unified, and zealously religious state runs out of frontier? It looks beyond the horizon. And 1492, that pivotal year, provided the means. In the fervent atmosphere of that victory, the monarchs made two other momentous decisions that would launch their project onto a global stage. First, seeking pure religious conformity, they issued a decree expelling all Jews from their kingdoms unless they converted. It was an act of profound intolerance that ripped a talented community from the heart of Spanish society. Second, they granted a hearing to a persistent Genoese sailor with a radical idea. His name was Christopher Columbus, and he proposed sailing west across the ocean sea to reach the fabled riches of the East. Skeptical but enticed by the possibility of outpacing their rival Portugal, the monarchs gave him ships. They were investing in a gamble whose stakes they could not possibly fathom. In October of that very same year, Columbus made landfall not in Asia, but on a Caribbean shore. He called the people he met Indios, believing he had reached the Indies. In reality, he had stumbled upon a continent unknown to Europe. He returned with tales, strange goods, and captured natives. The crown quickly realized this was not the spice route they envisioned, but something entirely new, a new world. And with that realization, the gears of empire began to turn. Ambition, faith, and a hunger for glory were about to cross an ocean. What kind of machinery would they build on those distant shores? The stage was now set for a project of unimaginable scale. With the Reconquista complete, the Spanish crown had a battle-hardened nobility, a powerful sense of religious mission, and a restless energy with no more Muslim kingdoms to conquer at home. Columbus's accidental discovery offered a new outlet, a vast, uncharted frontier. But those first encounters in the Caribbean were not the beginning of a careful exploration. They were the first steps of a conquest, one that would establish a ruthless template for empire. Columbus returned in 1493 with a much larger fleet, 17 ships and over 1,000 men. This was no longer a voyage of discovery, but of settlement and subjugation. The island of Hispaniola became the first laboratory for Spanish colonial rule. The Spanish founded a settlement, imposed their will on the local Taino people, and demanded tribute. The relationship soured almost immediately. Harsh discipline, foreign diseases, and a relentless search for gold created a nightmare for the indigenous population. Columbus himself proved to be a poor administrator, and his governorship ended in disgrace. Yet, the Spanish foothold held. Because the potential reward outweighed the chaos. Other adventurers, smelling opportunity, followed. They fanned out across the Caribbean, Puerto Rico, Jamaica, Cuba. On Cuba, conquistador Diego Velázquez established a more durable colony, founding settlements like Havana. The pattern was grimly consistent. Arrival, subjugation, the imposition of a system called the encomienda. This granted Spanish settlers control over indigenous communities, compelling their labor in exchange for supposed protection and Christian instruction. In reality, it was a system of brutal exploitation. The human cost was catastrophic. Indigenous societies, with no immunity to European diseases like smallpox and measles, were decimated. Communities were shattered by forced labor in mines and fields. Within a few decades, the population of the Caribbean collapsed. The Spanish, facing a vanishing labor force, would soon look to another continent for a terrible solution, the enslavement of Africans. But in these early years, the Caribbean served as a brutal school. It taught Spain how to project power across an ocean, how to exploit land and people, and how to justify it all with a crusader's faith. From these island bases, rumors began to filter back, whispers from the mainland of staggering wealth, tales of mighty empires built of stone, laden with gold, and ruled by powerful kings. For the ambitious men festering in the Caribbean, these were not just stories. They were a summons. One such man, simmering with ambition on Cuba, was Hernán Cortés. He had served under Velázquez, gained land and status, but his hunger was not satisfied by a Caribbean plantation. When word solidified of a powerful empire in the interior of Mexico, Cortés seized his destiny. He assembled a force, defied his governor's orders, and in 1519 sailed for the coast. What Cortés found upon landing was not a monolithic empire awaiting conquest, but a complex political landscape he could manipulate. The Aztec Empire, centered on the magnificent island city of Tenochtitlan, ruled through fear and tribute. Many subject peoples chafed under Aztec dominion. Cortés, a master of perception and alliance, recognized this immediately. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a diplomat and a strategist. With the crucial help of a Nahua woman named Malintzin, who acted as his translator and advisor, he forged alliances with these discontented groups. Thousands of indigenous warriors would join his march inland, not as captives, but as willing partners in toppling their Aztec overlords. In November 1519, Cortés and his men, accompanied by their new allies, beheld Tenochtitlan. It was a vision that defied European understanding. A city built on a lake, with causeways, floating gardens, and towering temples. It was larger, cleaner, and in many ways more sophisticated than most European capitals. The Aztec ruler, Moctezuma II, received them. Was he paralyzed by a belief these strangers were gods? Or was he playing a cautious political game, seeking to understand and control this new force? History remains unclear. What is certain is that he allowed the Spanish into the heart of his empire. It was a fatal miscalculation. Cortés, sensing both overwhelming opportunity and deadly peril, took Moctezuma hostage. He attempted to rule the empire through the captured emperor, a fragile and tense arrangement. But the strain broke. While Cortés was away dealing with a rival Spanish force, his lieutenant in the city massacred Aztec nobles during a religious ceremony. The city erupted in righteous fury. The Spanish and their allies were forced into a desperate, bloody escape, the Noche Triste or Night of Sorrows. Many Spaniards drowned in the lake, weighted down by stolen gold. It seemed like the end. Cortés had been expelled, his force shattered. But he was not finished. He retreated, regrouped with more indigenous allies who now saw the Spanish as their best hope against Aztec resurgence, and returned. He laid siege to the great city, cutting off its food and water. For months, the battle raged. Finally, in August 1521, starved and ravaged by smallpox, the unseen, biological ally the Spanish brought with them, Tenochtitlan fell. The Aztec Empire was broken. Cortés built a new Spanish capital, Mexico City, atop its ruins. Silver and gold began to flow back to Spain, igniting the imaginations of 1,000 more fortune seekers. But was this conquest a Spanish victory alone? Or was it a continent's existing rivalries, masterfully exploited, that brought the empire down? The truth, as always, was a collaboration of forces, both foreign and domestic. And the echoes of that collapse would soon be heard further south, where rumors spoke of an empire even richer, hidden in the cloud-wrapped mountains of the Andes. The fall of Tenochtitlan sent a shockwave through the Spanish world. It proved that unimaginable wealth was within grasp, and that a determined band of men could topple a mighty empire. The silver and gold that began to pour from Mexico across the Atlantic transformed Spain into a global superpower almost overnight. But for the conquistadors, Mexico was just the beginning. Their gaze turned south, drawn by persistent legends of another kingdom, a land of even greater treasure called Peru. The man who would chase this rumor into history was Francisco Pizarro. Unlike the shrewd Cortés, Pizarro was a man of brute determination. Illiterate, illegitimate, and hardened by decades of survival in the Indies, he embodied the raw ambition of the conquistador. He had heard the stories while serving in Panama, tales of a king who ruled from a golden city high in the mountains. In 1524, with partners Diego de Almagro and a priest, Hernando de Luque, he launched his first expedition down the Pacific coast. It was a disaster of storms, starvation, and hostile encounters. A second attempt fared little better. But on a jungle riverbank, they finally made contact with a coastal trading vessel. From it, they obtained tangible proof, pieces of finely worked silver and gold, and woven textiles of stunning quality. The rumors were true. Pizarro returned to Spain to secure a royal license for conquest. He received it from Emperor Charles V, who now ruled a sprawling Habsburg dominion that included Spain and its burgeoning American possessions. In 1530, Pizarro launched his third expedition. He landed on the northern coast of Peru with a force of fewer than 200 men, about 24 horses and a few cannon. It seemed like madness. The Inca Empire, known as Tawantinsuyu, was a bureaucratic marvel, connected by thousands of miles of roads, unified by a common language, and defended by tens of thousands of soldiers. How could a tiny band of foreigners hope to challenge it? Yet Pizarro arrived at a moment of catastrophic weakness. The empire was freshly torn apart by a brutal civil war. The Emperor Huayna Capac had died, likely from a European disease that had raced ahead of the conquistadors. His sons, Hualpa and Huáscar, fought a bloody war for the throne. Hualpa emerged victorious, but the realm was grieving, divided, and its military exhausted. Pizarro, learning of this strife through intermediaries, saw his opening. He marched inland to the highland town of Cajamarca, where Hualpa was resting with his victorious army. What happened next was a masterpiece of treachery and tactical shock. Pizarro invited the emperor to a meeting in the town square. Confident in his own power and perhaps curious about these strange bearded men, Hualpa arrived in a lavish litter, accompanied by thousands of unarmed attendants. A Spanish friar approached him, offering a Bible and demanding he submit to the Christian God and the Spanish king. When Hualpa, bewildered, threw the holy book to the ground, the Spanish gave a prearranged signal. Cannons roared, cavalry charged from hiding places, and steel swords cut down the packed, defenseless crowd. Thousands were slaughtered. Hualpa was taken prisoner. In one ruthless stroke, Pizarro had decapitated the empire. The Inca state was so centralized, so focused on the divine person of the Sapa Inca, that capturing him paralyzed the entire system. Hualpa, desperate to buy his freedom, offered a ransom beyond imagination, a room filled once with gold and twice over with silver. From across the empire, treasures flowed to Cajamarca, artworks, temple ornaments, sublime pieces of art melted down into crude bullion. The Spanish grew fabulously wealthy beyond their dreams. But once the ransom was paid, Pizarro broke his promise. After a sham trial, Hualpa was executed by strangulation in July 1533. The Spanish then marched on the imperial capital of Cusco, looting its temples and palaces. They installed a puppet ruler, but the conquest was far from clean. Resistance flared. The conquistadors themselves fell into violent conflict over the spoils, leading to a civil war among the Spaniards that ended with Almagro's execution and, later, Pizarro's own assassination in Lima, the city he founded. Yet, the Spanish crown was quick to impose order. The viceroyalty of Peru was established, and a vast administrative machine began to digest the Andes. The true engine of the empire, however, was discovered in 1545 at a remote mountain called Potosi. It was a mountain of silver, the richest single source of precious metal the world has ever known. To extract it, the Spanish revived and brutalized an Inca labor system called the Mita, forcing indigenous communities to send workers to the deadly mines by the thousands. The silver of Potosi would bankroll Spanish ambitions in Europe for centuries, inflating economies and fueling wars. But what was the human cost of this river of wealth? And how could a single monarchy, thousands of miles away across a stormy ocean, hope to govern such a vast, violent, and profitable new world? The answer lay in building an empire not just of conquest, but of relentless, bureaucratic control. The sheer scale of the territory now under the Spanish crown was staggering. By the mid-1500s, it claimed lands from the deserts of modern-day New Mexico to the rainforests of Chile, from the Caribbean islands to the peaks of the Andes. Conquest by the sword was one thing. Governing this colossal, fragmented realm was an entirely different challenge. The crown could not allow its new empire to be a collection of personal fiefdoms ruled by unruly conquistadors. It had to build a system, a machinery of control that could extract wealth, enforce faith, and maintain loyalty across an ocean. The first major step was the creation of the Council of the Indies in 1524. Based in Seville, this body became the brain of the empire, issuing laws, reviewing reports, and advising the king on all colonial matters. It was the supreme administrative and judicial authority for the Americas. But a council in Spain needed hands and eyes on the ground. For this, Spain devised the Viceroyalty. The Viceroyalty of New Spain, with its capital in Mexico City, was established in 1535. The Viceroyalty of Peru, centered on Lima, followed in 1542. The Viceroy was the king's direct representative, a figure of immense power who governed in his name. Beneath the Viceroy was a complex web of institutions designed to both administer and check each other. High courts known as audiencias handled judicial matters but also advised on governance. To prevent the rise of a colonial aristocracy with local loyalties, the crown favored peninsulars, Spaniards born in Europe, for the highest posts, often sidelining the criollos, Spaniards born in the Americas. This policy sowed deep-seated resentments that would simmer for centuries. The crown also issued a vast legal code, the Laws of the Indies, which dictated everything from city planning to the treatment of indigenous peoples. New towns were laid out in a rigid grid pattern around a central plaza, a model still visible across Latin America today. But how do you govern millions of people whose languages, cultures, and social structures are utterly foreign? The Spanish approach was a blend of pragmatism and imposed hierarchy. They often co-opted existing indigenous leadership. Local nobles, like the curacas in the Andes or the caciques in Mesoamerica, were used as intermediaries to collect tribute, organize labor, and facilitate conversion. This allowed a degree of continuity, but it also twisted these roles into instruments of colonial extraction. The economic engine of this system was relentless. The crown claimed a royal fifth of all precious metals mined. To manage the transatlantic flow of silver, they established the famed Flota system, annual convoys of treasure ships sailing from Veracruz and Cartagena to Seville, protected by warships. This monopolistic trade enriched the crown but stifled colonial economic development and bred rampant smuggling. All of this was underwritten by labor systems that bordered on slavery. The encomienda, though technically requiring the encomendero to protect and Christianize the natives, was in practice a license for brutal exploitation. In Peru, the Mita drained villages of men, sending them to die in the silver mines of Potosí. Was there any conscience in this system? Some voices cried out. The most famous was Bartolomé de las Casas, a former encomendero turned Dominican friar. His vivid writings detailed the horrific abuses inflicted on indigenous people, shocking the court and contributing to the passage of the new laws in 1542. These laws aimed to phase out the encomienda and protect native populations. But in the face of furious opposition from colonial elites thousands of miles away, enforcement was weak and inconsistent. The economic imperative of wealth extraction almost always trumped moral reform. And looming over everything was the Catholic Church, the empire's spiritual and ideological arm. Through the Patronato Real, the Spanish crown held extraordinary power over the church in the Americas, appointing bishops and controlling funds. In return, the church legitimized Spanish rule. Missionaries, Franciscans, Dominicans, Jesuits, were on the front lines of colonization, building missions, learning languages, and converting millions. Their work was a mixture of genuine belief, cultural destruction, and, at times, paternalistic protection. The Inquisition, though less ferocious than in Spain, also crossed the ocean to police heresy and conformity. This was the grand, contradictory architecture of Spanish Empire, a centralized bureaucracy trying to control a decentralized reality, laws promising protection that were ignored for profit, a church saving souls while justifying conquest. It was a system designed for stability and extraction, and for a time, it worked with terrifying efficiency. Silver built palaces in Madrid and paid armies in Flanders. But this very success planted the seeds of future conflict. By creating a class of resentful criollos and by exploiting indigenous populations to the point of collapse, the empire was building its own fault lines. And all the while, a silent, unseen passenger had been traveling with the conquistadors and colonists, a force more destructive than any army, disease. Its impact would reshape the hemisphere in a way no emperor could ever have imagined. While kings signed decrees and viceroys built palaces, a far more powerful force was silently reshaping the continents. The arrival of Spanish ships did more than carry soldiers and priests. They were unwitting vessels for a biological revolution. For millennia, the ecosystems of the Americas had evolved in isolation from those of Europe, Africa, and Asia. This separation ended abruptly in 1492, triggering what we now call the Columbian Exchange, a vast, uncontrolled transfer of plants, animals, people, and microbes that permanently altered the world. The most immediate and catastrophic element was the exchange of disease. Europeans brought with them a suite of pathogens to which Native American populations had no prior exposure, and thus no immunity. Smallpox was the deadliest, but measles, influenza, typhus, and malaria followed. These diseases spread like wildfire, often racing ahead of the conquistadors themselves. The results were apocalyptic. Historians estimate that in the first century after contact, up to 90% of the indigenous population in some regions perished. This was not just due to illness. The social collapse that followed, famine, the abandonment of farms, the loss of elders and knowledge, compounded the tragedy. Whole civilizations were gutted. The magnificent city of Tenochtitlan, already besieged by Cortés, was simultaneously being ravaged by smallpox, which killed its new ruler, Cuitlahuac, and decimated its defenders. In the Andes, smallpox likely killed the Inca Emperor Huayna Capac, plunging the empire into the civil war that Pizarro would exploit. The scale of death was so immense it defied understanding. For survivors, it must have felt as if the world itself was ending. For some Spanish clerics, it was misinterpreted as divine favor, a clearing of the land for Christianity. But what kind of world was being built upon this devastation? The exchange, however, was not a one-way street of destruction. Europe received transformative gifts from the Americas. Staple crops like maize, potatoes, tomatoes, chili peppers, cacao, and tobacco crossed the Atlantic. The potato, in particular, would revolutionize agriculture in Northern Europe, providing a cheap, calorie-rich food that helped fuel population booms. Tomatoes transformed Mediterranean cuisine. Chocolate became a coveted luxury. Tobacco, despite controversy, became a global habit. These new foods altered diets, economies, and even history itself. In the opposite direction, the Americas received a new suite of animals that reshaped its landscapes and societies. Horses, cattle, pigs, sheep, and goats, all previously unknown, were introduced. Some, like cattle and pigs, often escaped and formed vast wild herds, transforming ecosystems. Others, like the horse, were adopted with astonishing speed by some indigenous peoples. On the Great Plains of North America, tribes like the Comanche and Lakota would master horse culture, transforming their way of life, hunting, and warfare. The horse, a tool of European conquest, would later become a symbol of native resistance and adaptation. But the exchange also set the stage for new forms of exploitation. With indigenous labor dying out, the Spanish and later other Europeans turned to a horrific solution: the transatlantic slave trade from Africa. This forced migration, part of the Columbian Exchange's human toll, would bring millions of Africans to the Americas, creating diasporic cultures of immense resilience and profoundly shaping the social fabric of the New World. This biological and human mixing created entirely new societies. In Spanish America, complex racial classifications emerged: mestizo, mixed European and indigenous; mulatto, mixed European and African; Zambo, mixed indigenous and African. A rigid, though often fluid, caste system developed, linking social status and legal rights to perceived bloodlines. The Catholic Church played a central role in managing this new social order, often blending indigenous rituals with Christian doctrine to create syncretic forms of worship that endure to this day. The Columbian Exchange, therefore, was the unseen scaffolding of the empire. It enabled colonial settlement by devastating prior populations and introducing Old World crops and livestock. It enriched Europe and connected global economies. but it did so at an almost incomprehensible human cost. The empire Spain was building stood atop a demographic catastrophe. Yet, even as this new biological and social order took root, the center of Spanish power was shifting. The focus was no longer just on the Atlantic. For the true visionary of a global, Catholic empire, the entire world was a stage. That man was not in Mexico or Lima, but in a monastery palace in Spain, poring over maps and dispatches from every corner of the known world. His name was Philip II, and under his rule, the Spanish Empire would reach its dazzling, overextended peak. The weight of this global enterprise now settled on the shoulders of one of history's most dedicated monarchs. In 1556, Charles V, exhausted by ruling a patchwork of European and American domains, abdicated. His sprawling inheritance was divided. The Holy Roman Empire went to his brother, Ferdinand. But the crown of Spain, its lucrative Italian holdings, the restive Netherlands, and the vast, silver-rich empires of the Americas passed to his son, Philip II. It was under Philip that the Spanish Empire would reach its zenith in territorial expanse and ideological ambition, becoming the dominant force in Europe and a truly global power. Philip was a different ruler than his peripatetic father. He was meticulous, devout, and introverted. He preferred to govern from a fixed seat of power, and so he constructed the monumental El Escorial, part palace, part monastery, part mausoleum, in the austere hills outside Madrid. From this somber command center, he attempted to manage an empire upon which, as the famous phrase goes, the sun never set. His reign was driven by two unwavering principles: absolute loyalty to the Catholic faith and the relentless centralization of royal authority. This vision immediately faced severe tests. The wealthy provinces of the Netherlands, inherited from his father, were simmering with discontent. Protestant ideas, particularly Calvinism, had taken root among the merchant and artisan classes. Philip's determination to enforce religious orthodoxy and raise taxes sparked revolt in 1566. What began as protest exploded into the 80 Years' War. Philip sent his finest general, the Duke of Alba, whose Council of Troubles, nicknamed the Council of Blood, executed thousands. But repression only fueled resistance. The northern provinces, led by figures like William the Silent, fought fiercely for independence, eventually breaking away to form the Dutch Republic. It was a costly, draining conflict that exposed the limits of Spanish power. Yet, amidst this struggle, Philip could claim a moment of glorious triumph that resonated across Christendom. In the Mediterranean, the expansion of the Ottoman Empire under Suleiman the Magnificent posed a direct threat. To counter it, Philip helped forge the Holy League, an alliance of Catholic maritime states. In 1571, at the Battle of Lepanto off the coast of Greece, the League's fleet, with Spanish ships at its core, achieved a stunning victory over the Ottomans. It was the last great galley battle in history and a massive propaganda win for Philip, cementing his image as the most Catholic king and the shield of Europe. But his greatest confrontation was brewing in the cold waters of the north. England, under the Protestant Queen Elizabeth I, had become a persistent thorn. English privateers like Francis Drake raided Spanish treasure fleets with her tacit support, and England offered aid to the Dutch rebels. To Philip, Elizabeth was a heretic and a usurper. The execution of the Catholic Mary, Queen of Scots in 1587 removed any restraint. Philip conceived of a daring, knockout blow: the Spanish Armada. The plan was grand. A mighty fleet of over 130 ships would sail from Spain to the English Channel, rendezvous with a veteran Spanish army from the Netherlands, and ferry it across for a decisive invasion. In 1588, the Armada set sail. But the enterprise was plagued by flawed coordination, the tactical genius of English sea commanders like Drake and Howard, and ultimately, the fierce North Sea storms. The English used agile ships and fire ships to break the Spanish formation. The Protestant wind did the rest, scattering the crippled fleet on a disastrous retreat around Scotland and Ireland. Fewer than half the ships returned. The defeat of the Armada was a psychological watershed. It did not destroy Spanish naval power overnight, but it shattered the aura of invincibility and marked England's arrival as a major maritime challenger. For Philip, it was a profound personal and spiritual setback. How could God not favor his most devoted servant? He launched a second, equally ill-fated armada a few years later, but the moment had passed. Despite these reversals, Philip's empire still expanded. In 1580, a dynastic crisis in Portugal allowed him to claim its throne, uniting the Iberian Peninsula and bringing Portugal's own vast colonial network, including Brazil, trading posts in Africa and Asia, and claims in the Spice Islands, under the Spanish crown. For a time, Madrid ruled a global empire of unmatched scope. But this very grandeur was the empire's weakness. The constant warfare from the Netherlands to the English Channel, from the Mediterranean to the Americas, drained the treasury even as silver from Potosi flooded in. Philip was forced to declare state bankruptcy multiple times. The administrative system, though sophisticated, was slow and burdened by his own micromanagement. The relentless defense of Catholic orthodoxy alienated potential allies and fueled endless conflicts. When Philip II died in 1598, he left a paradox. The Spanish Empire was territorially at its peak, a colossus that straddled the globe. Its cultural influence was entering a golden age of art and literature. Yet, it was also financially exhausted, militarily overstretched, and facing a new world of emboldened rivals. The foundations laid by conquest and silver were beginning to crack under the weight of imperial overreach. And while soldiers and kings focused on battlefields and theology, a quieter, profound revolution was taking place in theaters, studies, and artists' workshops across Spain, a flourishing of creativity that would outlast the empire's political power. This was the Siglo de Oro, the Golden Age. Even as the empire's military and financial strains grew, Spain experienced an astonishing cultural flowering. This was the Siglo de Oro, the Golden Age, a period from the late 1500s through the 1600s when Spanish art, literature, and thought reached dazzling heights. It was a time of profound contradiction. A society engaged in brutal wars and rigid religious control simultaneously produced works of unparalleled depth, beauty, and human insight. The very tensions of empire, between faith and reason, glory and despair, reality and illusion, fueled this creative explosion. In literature, no figure looms larger than Miguel de Cervantes. A former soldier who lost the use of his left hand at the Battle of Lepanto and later suffered years of captivity, his life mirrored the turbulent times. In 1605, he published the first part of Don Quixote. The story of an aging nobleman who, addled by chivalric romances, sets out as a knight-errant with his pragmatic squire, Sancho Panza, was an instant sensation. On the surface, it was a hilarious satire of outdated ideals. But within its pages, Cervantes explored the very nature of truth, identity, and the human need to dream in a disillusioned world. Quixote's windmills, mistaken for giants, became an eternal symbol of noble but feudal struggle. The novel's genius lay in its compassion. It mocked its hero even as it celebrated his indefatigable spirit. The visual arts found their masters in painters who captured the era's spiritual intensity and royal grandeur. Dominating the scene was El Greco, a Greek-born artist who settled in Toledo. His works, with their elongated, feverish figures, mystical light, and dramatic compositions, were unlike anything else. Paintings like The Burial of the Count of Orgaz and View of Toledo conveyed a spiritual anxiety and ecstasy that resonated deeply in Counter-Reformation Spain. He portrayed a world stretched between earth and heaven, perfectly reflecting the nation's pious yet troubled soul. Following him, Diego Velázquez achieved a different kind of mastery. As the court painter to King Philip IV, Velázquez possessed an unparalleled ability to capture reality with subtlety and psychological depth. His portraits of the royal family are not just majestic, they are hauntingly human, revealing the weight of isolation and power. His masterpiece, Los Meneses, is a dizzying puzzle of perception, showing the artist himself at work in a room with the young Infanta Margarita, her attendants, and, reflected in a distant mirror, the faces of the king and queen. Who is the subject? Who is the viewer? The painting becomes a profound meditation on art, truth, and the nature of reality itself, themes that preoccupied a society questioning its own place in a changing world. The stage, too, was a vital arena. Playwrights like Lope de Vega, a phenomenally prolific genius, defined Spanish theater. He broke from strict classical rules, crafting fast-paced, emotionally charged dramas that mixed comedy and tragedy, noblemen and commoners. His play Fuenteovejena, based on a true story of a village's collective rebellion against a tyrannical commander, explored potent themes of justice, honor, and popular sovereignty. Another giant, Pedro Calderón de la Barca, penned works of philosophical grandeur. His life is a dream asked essential questions. Are we prisoners of fate? What separates our dreams from our waking life? In an empire built on certainties of faith and monarchy, these were daring inquiries. This cultural wealth was supported by imperial silver but was often critically engaged with the empire's own conscience. Writers and artists reflected on the moral cost of conquest and the illusions of power. Even as the state celebrated its global dominion, its greatest minds were exploring doubt, identity, and the fragility of human projects. The Golden Age was not mere propaganda. It was the empire's conscience and its critique, a dazzling mirror held up to its own complex soul. Yet, while poets wrote and painters mixed their pigments, the imperial machinery continued to grind onward, now looking beyond the Americas. The vast Pacific Ocean, once a terrifying barrier, had become a Spanish highway. From the ports of Mexico, a new colonial project had already begun, one that would connect the riches of the Americas directly to the ancient markets of Asia. The destination was an archipelago of over 7,000 islands, the Philippines. This trans-Pacific leap would complete the empire's circumnavigation of the globe, but it would also stretch its resources to the breaking point. How could a government struggling in Europe hope to maintain a foothold on the opposite side of the world? The answer would involve galleons, missionaries, and a trade route of legendary danger and profit. The push across the Pacific was an audacious gamble. While Cortés and Pizarro had conquered land-based empires, the challenge in Asia was different. Vast distances, established trade networks, and powerful competitors. The Spanish claim originated with Ferdinand Magellan's expedition, which, sailing under the Spanish flag, reached the Philippines in 1521. Magellan was killed there, but one of his ships completed the first circumnavigation of the globe, proving the world was interconnected. Yet for decades, Spain focused on the Americas. It was not until 1565 that a determined explorer, Miguel López de Legazpi, backed by the Viceroy of New Spain, established a permanent foothold. Legazpi's expedition, accompanied by the navigator Andrés de Urdaneta, achieved two critical goals. First, they founded settlements on the islands of Cebu and, later, Manila on Luzon. Second, Urdaneta discovered a viable return route to the Americas by sailing north to catch prevailing winds that would carry ships to the California coast before turning south to Mexico. This navigational breakthrough made sustained colonization possible. Manila, with its superb natural harbor, was perfectly positioned. It became the nexus of a revolutionary trade system, the Manila Galleon. Once or twice a year, a massive galleon, loaded with silver mined in Peru and Mexico, would sail from Acapulco to Manila. That silver was used to purchase coveted Asian goods, Chinese silks, porcelain, ivory, spices, and lacquerware, brought to Manila's markets by Chinese and Southeast Asian merchants. The galleon would then brave the perilous return voyage across the Pacific, laden with treasures that would be distributed throughout the Americas and onward to Europe. For over 250 years, this single ship, sometimes two, functioned as a trans-Pacific economic artery, making Manila a vibrant, cosmopolitan hub and funneling American silver directly into the Asian economy. Spanish rule in the Philippines, however, followed a familiar colonial pattern, adapted to a new environment. Military force secured key areas, but the real instrument of integration was the Catholic Church. Augustinian, Franciscan, Dominican, and Jesuit missionaries fanned out, building churches, learning local languages, and converting populations. Unlike in the Americas, they encountered a fragmented array of cultures and polities, with Islamic sultanates firmly established in the southern islands. Conversion was a slow process of persuasion and coercion, creating a deeply Christianized core in Luzon and the Visayas that endures today. The colony was governed as an extension of New Spain, Mexico, not directly from Madrid. A governor-general in Manila reported to the viceroy in Mexico City. This administrative oddity meant the Philippines was often an afterthought in Spanish court politics, yet it was crucial to Spain's self-image as a global power. It was a bold statement. Spain could project its faith and flag to the very opposite side of the world. But this far-flung possession was perpetually vulnerable. The Spanish never fully conquered the Muslim South Moroland, leading to centuries of intermittent conflict. Chinese traders, essential to the colony's economy, faced periodic persecution and violent pogroms. And then there were rival European powers. The Dutch, locked in their own war for independence from Spain, attacked Spanish positions in the Philippines repeatedly in the early 1600s, though they never captured Manila. The English would later pose a threat. Defending this remote node required resources Spain could scarcely spare. The Philippines illustrated both the breathtaking scope and the profound fragility of the empire. It was a bridge between two worlds, a feat of navigation and endurance. Yet, it was a precarious outpost, dependent on a single annual ship and surrounded by potential enemies. It symbolized an empire stretched so thin that its threads were beginning to snap. And while this Pacific frontier was being consolidated, the heart of the empire in Europe was entering a period of catastrophic decline. The strain of endless wars, economic mismanagement, and internal stagnation was about to culminate in a crisis that would threaten the very survival of the Spanish state. The trigger would not be a foreign army, but a question of royal blood. The 17th century dawned on a Spain that was outwardly mighty but internally decaying. The relentless wars, the crushing cost of maintaining global defenses, and an economy overly reliant on finite American silver had taken a toll. The state declared bankruptcy repeatedly. Inflation raged. Population stagnated. This period, known as the Spanish Crisis, saw the empire grappling with a painful truth: it could no longer sustain its own vastness. The central authority in Madrid grew weaker, while regional nobles regained power. Yet, the empire clung to its possessions even as its grip loosened. The true reckoning, however, arrived with the turn of the 18th century, centered on a fragile king and the vacuum he left. Charles II, the last Habsburg monarch of Spain, was physically and mentally infirm, a tragic product of generations of royal inbreeding. His reign was a shadow play, dominated by court factions. Most critically, he produced no heir. As he lay dying in 1700, all of Europe held its breath. Who would inherit this sprawling, weakened, but still prestigious global empire? Charles's was named Philip, Duke of Anjou, grandson of the powerful French King Louis XIV, as his successor. The prospect of the Bourbon dynasties of France and Spain uniting under a single family terrified the other European powers. It promised a Franco-Spanish bloc that could dominate the continent and the world's trade routes. In response, a grand alliance formed: England, the Dutch Republic, Austria, and several German states, to support an alternative claimant, Archduke Charles of Austria. Their goal was to prevent Bourbon hegemony and carve up the Spanish inheritance. Thus began the War of the Spanish Succession in 1701, a conflict that was both a European-wide power struggle and a Spanish civil war. Battles raged from the Netherlands to Italy to the Iberian Peninsula itself. In Spain, the war split the country. The central region of Castile largely supported the Bourbon claimant, Philip V. But the eastern kingdoms of the Crown of Aragon, fearing the loss of their ancient privileges under a centralizing French-style monarchy, backed the Austrian Archduke Charles. The conflict was brutal, laying waste to towns and countryside. The war also spilled across the Atlantic, with British raids on Spanish colonial ports. It was a true world war, foreshadowing the imperial conflicts of the future. For over a decade, Spain was both a prize and a battlefield. The fighting finally ended with the Treaty of Utrecht in 1713. The settlement reshaped the map of Europe and the world. Philip V was confirmed as King of Spain, but he and his heirs had to renounce any claim to the French throne, severing the feared union. The price for Spain was steep. It lost its European territories. The Spanish Netherlands, Naples, Milan, and Sardinia were ceded to Austria. Gibraltar and Minorca were handed to Great Britain, giving it a permanent strategic foothold in the Mediterranean. Spain's era as the preeminent European power was definitively over. The defeat was a humiliation, but it also created an opportunity. The new Bourbon dynasty, shaken by the experience, embarked on a sweeping project to save what remained of the empire by fundamentally reforming it. Philip V and his successors, particularly Charles III, implemented the Bourbon reforms. This was a comprehensive effort to modernize and centralize the Spanish state and its colonial administration, inspired by Enlightenment ideas of rational governance and efficiency. The old, quasi-feudal Habsburg system was dismantled. Regional autonomy, especially in Aragon and Catalonia, was crushed by the Nueva Planta decrees, forging a more unified, absolutist state. In the Americas, the reforms were even more transformative. New viceroyalties were created: New Granada, centered in Bogotá, and the Rio de la Plata, centered in Buenos Aires, to improve administration and defense. The intrusive office of the intendant was introduced, royal bureaucrats sent to bypass corrupt local elites and tighten fiscal control. Trade was liberalized, breaking the monopoly of the old fleet system and allowing multiple Spanish and colonial ports to trade directly. The goal was clear: make the empire more profitable, more defensible, and more directly obedient to Madrid. But these rational, top-down reforms had explosive unintended consequences. By promoting free trade, they stimulated colonial economies and empowered a new class of wealthy Criollo merchants. By creating colonial militias for defense, they gave Criollos military training and a sense of local pride. By attacking the power of the church, most dramatically in the expulsion of the Jesuits in 1767, they alienated a powerful institution and the many who were educated by it. The Bourbon reforms succeeded in revitalizing imperial revenue, but in doing so, they awakened a new political consciousness in the colonies. They made the Criollos more capable and more aware of their own interests, which increasingly diverged from those of a distant king. The very measures meant to strengthen imperial bonds were, in fact, steadily fraying them. And in the mountains of Peru and the towns of New Granada, this friction was about to ignite into open flame. The Bourbon reforms, with their taxes, monopolies, and peninsular officials, pressed down hard on colonial society. For the indigenous populations and mixed-race mestizos, it often meant deeper exploitation. For the American-born Criollo elites, it meant exclusion from high office and resentment. This pressure, building for decades, finally found release in a series of violent, seismic revolts that shook the foundations of Spanish America in the late 18th century. These were not yet calls for independence, but they were deafening warnings that the colonial pact was breaking. The first major tremor struck the Viceroyalty of New Granada, modern Colombia, in 1781. The trigger was new, strictly enforced taxes on everyday goods like tobacco and liquor. The revolt, led by a mixed-race merchant named Juan Francisco Burbio, united indigenous communities, peasants, and Criollo artisans under the banner of the Comuneros. An army of tens of thousands marched on the capital, Bogotá. Facing this force, colonial officials panicked and signed the capitulations of Zipaquirá, agreeing to scrap the new taxes and redress grievances. It was a stunning, bloodless victory for the people. But it was an illusion. Once the rebel army disbanded, the authorities revoked the agreements. The leaders were hunted down and executed. The message was clear: promises from Madrid and its agents were written in sand. A far more profound and terrifying eruption occurred in the Andes. Here, the resentment was not just about taxes, but about centuries of oppression. It found a leader in José Gabriel Condorcanqui, a cacique, indigenous noble, who claimed direct descent from the last Inca emperors. He took the name Tupac Amaru II. Educated, charismatic, and fluent in both Spanish and Quechua, he initially used Spanish courts to petition for an end to the abusive Mita labor system and the corrupt rule of provincial officials. When his legal appeals were ignored, he turned to rebellion. In 1780, Tupac Amaru II captured and executed a notoriously cruel colonial administrator. The act was a spark in a tinderbox. What followed was a massive, pan-indigenous uprising that swept across southern Peru and into modern Bolivia and Argentina. Tupac Amaru's rhetoric was potent. He spoke of ending Spanish abuses, not necessarily Spanish rule, and invoked the lost glory of the Inca. For a time, he commanded an army that besieged cities and controlled major highways. But the movement suffered from internal divisions and lacked the weaponry to defeat the reinforced royal armies. In 1781, after his capture, Tupac Amaru II was taken to the main square in Cusco. Before his execution, he was forced to watch the killings of his wife, his sons, and his key lieutenants. Then he was quartered by horses. The brutality was intentional, a spectacle of terror meant to extinguish the very idea of Inca revival. The repression was genocidal. Indigenous language and cultural symbols were banned. Yet, the rebellion spirit could not be wholly eradicated. It exposed the raw, unhealed wound of conquest and proved that indigenous America was not a passive subject, but a volatile force. It also frightened the Criollo elites, who saw in the uprising a threat to the entire social order, not just Spanish rule. This fear would later make many Criollos hesitant to embrace popular revolution. Simultaneously, the Age of Enlightenment was quietly penetrating the colonial mind. Books by Montesquieu, Rousseau, and Voltaire were smuggled into port cities. The success of the American Revolution, 1776, provided a concrete example of colonies breaking free. The French Revolution, 1789, with its radical ideas of liberty and citizenship, sent shockwaves through the Spanish government, which redoubled censorship. But ideas, once released, are hard to recapture. Criollo intellectuals began to think in new terms: natural rights, popular sovereignty, the social contract. Then, news arrived of a revolution that was even more terrifying to the colonial elite. In 1791, the enslaved people of the French colony of Saint-Domingue, Haiti, rose up. After over a decade of brutal warfare, they threw out the French and declared the world's first black republic in 1804. For Spanish officials and Criollo landowners, the Haitian Revolution was a nightmare scenario, a successful slave revolt that overturned the racial hierarchy fundamental to colonial society. It made them deeply fearful of mobilizing the lower classes or ending slavery in their own lands. By the dawn of the 19th century, Spanish America was a cauldron of contradictory forces. The imperial system was more efficient at extracting wealth but less legitimate in the eyes of its subjects. Criollos yearned for respect and power. Indigenous and mixed-race masses bore the brunt of exploitation. Enlightenment ideas offered new political visions, while the Haitian example instilled a paralyzing fear of racial war. The empire was held together by inertia, habit, and the overwhelming power of the Spanish military. But what would happen if that power itself suddenly vanished? That unimaginable scenario was about to become a reality. The spark would come not from a colonial rebel, but from the Emperor of France, and it would ignite the world. The earthquake that finally shattered the empire's frame originated not in the Americas, but in the heart of Europe. In 1807, the ambitious French Emperor Napoleon Bonaparte turned his gaze to the Iberian Peninsula. Under the pretext of invading Portugal, he flooded Spain with his troops. Then, in a brazen act of political theft, he lured the weak Spanish King Charles IV and his son Ferdinand to the French town of Bayonne, forced them both to abdicate, and placed his own brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the Spanish throne. It was a masterstroke of deceit that left Spain without its legitimate monarchs. The Spanish people reacted with furious, spontaneous defiance. In May 1808, a popular uprising in Madrid was brutally suppressed by French troops, but the spirit of resistance, the guerrilla, was born. Local councils, called juntas, sprang up across the country, claiming to rule in the name of the captive Ferdinand VII. A bloody, protracted war of independence against the French occupation began. In the colonies, the news arrived like a thunderclap. The source of all authority, the king, had disappeared. Who held sovereignty now? The French usurper? The rebellious Spanish juntas? Or did it revert to the people of the colonies themselves? In the initial confusion, most colonial elites declared loyalty to the deposed Ferdinand VII. But they refused to recognize the authority of the Spanish juntas or, of course, King Joseph. This created a profound constitutional crisis. If the king was gone, where did power reside? In 1810, as the war in Spain dragged on, colonial cities began to answer that question for themselves. From Caracas to Buenos Aires, from Bogotá to Santiago, Criollo-led juntas took control of local governments, expelling Spanish officials. They still proclaimed allegiance to Fernando VII, but this was largely a fiction to buy time and legitimacy. They were, in practice, self-governing. The door to revolution was now wide open. Two distinct paths emerged. In the Rio de la Plata, Argentina, the process was relatively swift. After removing the viceroy in 1810, the local junta faced internal struggles but little sustained royalist military opposition in the region. Paraguay and Uruguay broke away on their own trajectories. By 1816, the United Provinces of the Rio de la Plata formally declared independence. But in other regions, the fight would be long, bloody, and led by legendary figures. In the north of South America, the struggle was defined by Simón Bolívar, a wealthy, educated Criollo from Caracas. Inspired by Enlightenment philosophy and a burning sense of destiny, Bolívar envisioned not just independence, but the creation of a vast, unified Spanish-American republic to rival the great powers. His early campaigns in Venezuela ended in defeat and a harrowing exile. Yet, he returned, famously vowing in his Cartagena Manifesto that the key to victory was a relentless offensive. In a stunning strategic move in 1819, he led his small, ragged army, including British and Irish mercenaries, on a desperate crossing of the flooded plains and icy passes of the Andes into New Granada. Exhausted and half-starved, they surprised and destroyed the royalist army at the Battle of Boyaca, securing the independence of New Granada, Colombia. With this new base, Bolívar marched back to liberate Venezuela and then moved south. Meanwhile, in the south, another liberator was advancing north. José de San Martín, an Argentine-born officer trained in the Spanish army, was a master of logistics and disciplined strategy. After securing Argentina's independence, he performed his own miraculous feat, leading the Army of the Andes across the towering mountain range into Chile in 1817. The victory at the Battle of Chacabuco secured Chilean freedom. San Martín then built a navy, sailed to Peru, and captured Lima in 1821. However, the royalist core remained strong in the Peruvian highlands. Stalemated and perhaps wary of the political chaos he saw brewing, San Martín made a fateful decision. In 1822, he met secretly with Bolívar in the Ecuadorian city of Guayaquil. After their private conference, San Martín, surrendering his ambition for the sake of the cause, resigned his command and went into exile in Europe, leaving the final act to Bolívar. The stage was set for the empire's last stand. Bolívar's lieutenant, the brilliant but ruthless Antonio José de Sucre, marched into the Peruvian highlands. In 1824, he delivered two crushing blows. At the Battle of Junín, cavalry charges decided the day. Then, in December at the Battle of Ayacucho, on a high plain, Sucre's forces encircled and annihilated the last major royalist army. The viceroy was captured. Spanish power in South America was finished. The vast continent, once the crown jewel of the empire, was now a collection of fledgling, struggling republics. But one major colony remained, and its path to freedom would be unlike any other, born not from a Criollo general's campaign, but from a priest's cry of social justice that ignited a continent's deepest fears. The final act of the mainland empire's collapse unfolded in New Spain, today's Mexico. Here, The road to independence did not begin with enlightened Criollo elites plotting in city halls. It began with a cry of social and economic justice from the rural heartland, a cry that would expose the deep racial and class fractures the empire had created. In 1810, in the small town of Dolores, a parish priest named Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla did the unthinkable. On September 16th, he rang his church bell, gathering his largely indigenous and mestizo parishioners. In an impassioned speech, the Grito de Dolores, he denounced Spanish oppression, called for the end of bad government, and invoked the Virgin of Guadalupe, a powerful symbol of Mexican identity. This was not a call for negotiated autonomy, it was a rallying cry for mass revolt. Thousands of peasants, armed with machetes and farm tools, flocked to his banner. This was a social revolution, targeting not just Spanish officials but the Criollo elite as well. Hidalgo's army swept through the Bajío region, capturing major cities like Guanajuato. But the movement's radical, often chaotic nature, and its violence against Criollo properties, terrified the colonial upper classes. This fear drove them to close ranks with the royalists. The rebel army, immense but undisciplined, faltered before the gates of Mexico City. Hidalgo retreated, was captured, and executed by a firing squad in 1811. The rebellion seemed crushed. But the flame was past. Another priest, José María Morelos y Pavón, a former student of Hidalgo's, proved to be a far more capable military and political leader. He secured control of much of southern Mexico and, crucially, convened a Congress in 1813 that issued a truly revolutionary document, the Sentiments of the Nation. It declared Mexican independence, abolished slavery, promoted racial equality, and called for universal male suffrage. It was one of the most radical visions of the age. Morelos was captured and executed in 1815, and his movement fractured into scattered guerrilla bands. For years, the independence struggle seemed lost, degenerating into a brutal, low-intensity conflict. What finally tipped the scales was not a rebel victory, but a conservative coup. In 1820, a liberal revolution in Spain forced Ferdinand VII to restore the progressive constitution of 1812. This terrified the Mexican Criollo elite and the Catholic Church, who feared the loss of their privileges and anti-clerical reforms. Independence suddenly became a tool for preserving the traditional, conservative social order. A royalist officer, Agustin de Iturbide, was tasked with finishing off the last rebel leader, Vicente Guerrero. Instead, Iturbide, recognizing the shifting winds, struck a deal with Guerrero. In 1821, they issued the Plan of Iguala, offering 3 guarantees: independence from Spain, the supremacy of the Catholic Church, and the unity of all Mexicans, Spaniards, and Americans. This conservative, unifying platform was exactly what the elite wanted. With the army and the church behind it, the plan succeeded rapidly. Iturbide's army of the 3 guarantees marched into Mexico City in September 1821, and Spanish rule ended without a major battle. Ironically, Mexico's independence was secured not by the radical priests who started the fight, but by the conservative forces that had originally opposed them. With Mexico and South America free, the Spanish Empire in the Americas was reduced to 2 Caribbean islands, Cuba and Puerto Rico. Here, the dynamics were different. Fears of a repeat of the Haitian Revolution, a massive slave uprising, made the local Criollo sugar planters hesitant to support independence. Spain, for its part, clung to these ever-faithful isles with grim determination, investing heavily in fortifications and offering limited reforms to keep the elites content. For now, these last remnants of the mainland empire would remain. By the 1820s, the map had been redrawn. The empire that had taken 3 centuries to build had disintegrated in less than 2 decades. Spain was left reeling, a second-class European power clutching the fragments of its former glory: Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and a few minor territories. The loss was a national trauma, but it was not the final chapter. The story of the Spanish Empire now entered a long, slow epilogue, a desperate and ultimately doomed struggle to hold onto its last colonies against rising new empires and the unstoppable tide of nationalism. The final, decisive confrontation would not be with liberating armies, but with a young, ambitious republic to the north. The 19th century became Spain's long retreat. Stripped of its continental American empire, it clung with a kind of desperate nostalgia to its remaining colonies: Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines. These islands were now more than possessions. They were symbols of a fading imperial identity, proof that Spain was still a power with global reach. But holding them became a draining, bloody struggle against new forces, colonial nationalism, and the imperial ambitions of other nations. Cuba was the crown jewel, its economy turbocharged by sugar. Enslaved African labor made fortunes for plantation owners, both peninsular and Criollo. But the same economic boom created tensions. Criollo elites chafed under Spanish mercantilist policies and political exclusion. Abolitionist sentiments grew internationally and among some Cubans. The first major war for Cuban independence, the 10 Years' War, erupted in 1868. Led by the planter Carlos Manuel de Céspedes, who famously freed his own slaves to join the fight, it was a brutal guerrilla conflict. Spain committed massive resources, employing scorched earth tactics and promising reforms. The war ended in 1878 with a stalemate, promises of greater autonomy and the abolition of slavery, finally enacted in 1886, but not independence. The peace was fragile. Cuban nationalist thought crystallized around the figure of José Martí, a poet, journalist, and revolutionary thinker exiled in New York. He founded the Cuban Revolutionary Party, advocating for a republic with all and for the good of all, free from both Spanish rule and the looming threat of U.S. expansion. In 1895, Martí returned to Cuba and launched a new war. He was killed early, but the rebellion, led by Máximo Gómez and Antonio Maceo, spread rapidly. The Spanish response was horrific. General Valeriano Weyler instituted a reconcentration policy, forcing rural civilians into camps where tens of thousands died from disease and starvation. In the Philippines, a parallel national awakening was underway. A class of educated Filipinos, the Ilustrados, many studying in Europe, began to agitate for reform. Their greatest voice was José Rizal, a doctor and novelist whose books, Nali Mi Tangere and El Filibusterismo, exposed the corruption and cruelty of Spanish friars and officials. Rizal sought peaceful assimilation and equality within the Spanish Empire, not revolution. But his writings inspired more radical forces. In 1896, the secret society Katipunan, led by Andrés Bonifacio, launched an armed revolt. Although Rizal was executed that same year, martyring the cause, the Philippine Revolution gained ground. Spain was now fighting two major colonial insurgencies on opposite sides of the globe. Its military was overstretched, its treasury depleted, and its government unstable, swinging between liberal and conservative factions. The world was watching, and one nation in particular saw strategic opportunity in Spain's distress: the United States. American business had massive investments in Cuban sugar. Sensationalist, yellow journalism in U.S. newspapers whipped up public outrage over Spanish atrocities. The mysterious explosion of the USS Maine in Havana Harbor in February 1898, blamed on Spain by the American press, became the final pretext. In April 1898, the United States declared war on Spain. The Spanish-American War was less a war than a surgical demolition of a weakened empire. It was over in months. In the Pacific, Commodore George Dewey's squadron annihilated the antiquated Spanish fleet at Manila Bay in a single morning. In the Caribbean, the U.S. Navy destroyed another Spanish fleet off Santiago de Cuba. American troops, alongside Cuban rebels, won quick land victories. By August, Spain surrendered. The Treaty of Paris, 1898, sealed the empire's fate. Spain ceded Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines to the United States. Cuba was granted nominal independence but fell under overwhelming U.S. influence. In a single, swift conflict, Spain lost almost everything that remained of its overseas empire. The defeat was so total, so humiliating, it was known simply as El Disaster, the disaster. A generation of Spanish writers and intellectuals, the generation of '98, would agonize over this national catastrophe, searching for Spain's soul in its defeat. One final, poignant loss followed. In 1899, Spain sold its remaining Pacific islands, the Carolines, the Marianas, except Guam, and Palau, to Germany. With that transaction, the last fragments of the Trans-Pacific Empire born from Magellan and Legazpi were gone. Spain was now a European nation, its global role vanished. The empire that had once dictated terms to the world was finished. Yet, as the political entity died, its legacy was entering a new, enduring phase. It was no longer an empire of viceroys and galleons, but an empire of language, faith, and culture, woven into the fabric of nations across the world. This invisible empire would prove far more persistent than any fortress. The year 1899 marked the formal end. With the sale of its last Pacific archipelago, Spain's sovereignty over lands beyond Europe ceased. The political entity known as the Spanish Empire was dead. But an empire is more than flags and forts. It is a legacy etched into the lives of millions. As the dust of El Disaster settled, a different kind of dominion revealed itself, one built not on coercion, but on the enduring foundations of language, belief, and memory. The most palpable legacy is the Spanish language itself. It is the indelible imprint, spoken by hundreds of millions across 24 nations. It is not a fossilized colonial relic, but a living, evolving force. In the streets of Mexico City, the poetry of Santiago, the novels of Bogotá, and the lyrics of San Juan, Spanish carries the weight and rhythm of countless local histories. It became a shared tongue that unified disparate indigenous worlds, even as it suppressed others. Today, it is a global bridge, a continent-spanning conversation that continues to grow. Alongside language walks the profound influence of Catholicism. The cross followed the sword, but outlasted the crown. From the magnificent cathedrals of Lima to the humble village churches of the Philippines, the faith planted by missionaries took deep root. It fused with indigenous spiritualities, creating unique syncretic traditions, the Day of the Dead in Mexico, the festivals of the Andes, the folk Catholicism of the Philippines. The church shaped moral frameworks, educational systems, and the very calendar of life. Even in an increasingly secular age, its cultural footprint defines the rhythm of community and celebration. Look at the cityscapes. The Grand Plaza Mayor, flanked by the cathedral and the government palace, remains the heart of countless towns. The grid-like street plans ordained by the laws of the Indies still channel modern traffic. Architectural styles, from ornate Baroque to severe neoclassical, speak of a time when aesthetics were an instrument of imperial and divine glory. This physical canvas, the stage for daily life, is a permanent inheritance. The legal and administrative DNA of the empire persists. Concepts of written civil law, notarial tradition, and bureaucratic structure form the backbone of many national systems. The very idea of a centralized state, for better or worse, was a Spanish introduction. The social hierarchies of the colonial era, though officially dismantled, left long shadows on attitudes toward race, class, and identity that modern societies still grapple with. And what of Spain itself? The loss of empire provoked a century of introspection, a struggle between mourning and regeneration. The generation of '98 picked through the ruins of national pride, seeking a new path. The debate over this past is never closed. Statues of conquistadors are now sites of protest. The celebration of Columbus Day is contested. Spain navigates a complex relationship with its former colonies, a mix of cultural affinity, diplomatic partnership, and the unavoidable need to confront historical injustices. This is the final, paradoxical truth. The Spanish Empire fell because it could not sustain the material cost of its own grandeur. But it succeeded, perhaps unintentionally, in creating a cultural world. It forged connections across oceans, setting in motion the first truly global exchange of goods, people, ideas, and maladies. It was an engine of both catastrophic destruction and extraordinary creation. Its story is a human story, full of staggering ambition, profound cruelty, resilient faith, and unexpected fusion. It reminds us that empires are not monoliths. They are collections of countless individual choices, moments of courage and brutality, resistance and adaptation. They rise through force of will, they reign through complex administration, and they fall under the weight of their own contradictions. But they do not simply vanish. They dissolve into the stream of history, leaving a sediment that shapes the banks of the future. The sun finally set on the Spanish Empire. But in the twilight, it left a world irrevocably linked, for good and ill, by the echoes of its long reign. The story ends, but the conversation it started continues in every spoken word, every whispered prayer, and every memory etched in stone across the globe. Thank you for listening to this journey with Sleepy Owl. If this story of rise and fall resonated with you, share it with someone who loves history. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into the narratives that shaped our world. What legacy of this vast empire do you see most clearly in the world today? Let us know in the comments below. Good night.